Okay, let's plunge right into this deep dive. We're looking at a really interesting puzzle today. Why Somalia's push towards, a full democracy seems to be hitting some serious roadblocks.
Yeah, it's complex. And we're basing this discussion mainly on a paper by a legal scholar, Abdullahi Yabaro. It's called Untethering Somalia's Democratic Transition.
Untethering. I find that title really evocative.
It is, and the source gets straight to the point. It argues pretty forcefully, actually, that Somalia's democratic process isn't dead. Not at all. It's just, well,
Tethered, right.
Yeah,
Like a horse that wants to run but can't. It suggests the energy, the desire, it's all there.
exactly.
Something's physically holding it back.
That's the core metaphor. The author says the potential, the vision, the horse, if you will. It's alive and kicking,
Right.
but it's tied down, deliberately constrained.
Okay, so our goal here, for you listening, is to really unpack what those ropes are. The source talks about external and internal constraints. We need to figure out what the author identifies. And then, crucially, look at the steps. The source says Somalia needs to take these assertive actions to actually cut those ropes, to let that democratic horse, well, run free.
Right. Let it gallop, essentially.
So the paper does acknowledge progress, right? It talks about a definite shift away from the old system. What does that shift look like, according to the source?
It highlights a real break, yeah.
Yeah.
Moving away from that old model, the indirect selection process, which, let's be honest, was widely seen as discredited, dominated by elites.
Right.
The aim now, the source says, is clearly towards a people-driven system. One person, one vote. That's the stated goal.
And there's legislation to back that up.
Absolutely. The paper points to tangible steps. The federal parliament, for instance, has actually enacted laws to enable direct elections. That's significant.
Public?
Described as enthusiastic, people are participating, showing support. There's a sense that a new direction has been chosen. So yeah, the horse is definitely alive.
And there's always a but, isn't there? The source quickly shifts gears. Despite the laws, despite the public will, the process is described as largely immobilized. So what's the main reason given for this stall?
And this is critical to the author's argument.
Yeah.
It's not blamed on a lack of vision. It's not that people don't want it.
Okay.
The source points squarely at what it calls deliberate constraints, external and internal. These are the tethers. Things like institutional dependency, political interference, and also a reluctance from certain groups, especially, established elites, to actually give up their long-held influence.
So the desire is there, the framework's kind of there, but these forces are actively, deliberately holding it back.
That's the picture painted.
Oh.
A horse wants to run, but someone's holding the ropes tight.
The paper then suggests that even the reforms we have seen might be a bit of an illusion or maybe just partial. What's behind that assessment?
Well, the argument is that while the legal changes, like the election laws, are good steps, they're still vulnerable.
Vulnerable.
They could be undermined, delayed. And crucially, the actual preparation for elections, the logistics, the technical side, it still relies heavily on foreign support. Money, expertise, you name it.
Okay, so that dependency is a really thick rope then.
It seems to be, yeah. A major tether.
Yeah.
The source notes the Somali government has tried to take more ownership, but it's only partially successful so far.
So surface changes, but maybe not deep structural shifts yet.
That's the argument. The underlying power dynamics, the old ways of doing things, they remain largely intact, according to the paper.
And this links to what the source calls a restricted political space, this vulnerability, this dependence.
Exactly. The author contends that these reforms are happening, but they're happening in an arena where key political decisions are still, heavily influenced, sometimes even controlled, by outside actors.
And these actors are using outdated methods.
That's the claim. Using frameworks from the transitional era, which the source argues just don't fit Somalia's status now as a sovereign nation, so it restricts the space for genuinely independent Somali-led decisions.
Right. So given that whole picture of dependency, the source then highlights a specific government action as a real attempt to cut one of these ropes. A legal move, rejecting the C6 plus framework. What was that about?
Yeah, this is presented as quite significant. It happened, according to the source, in June 2025. The Somali Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent a formal letter, a note verbal, to the UN.
Okay.
And it basically said, this C6 plus framework, it's obsolete. It's actually counterproductive now.
C6 plus. Remind us what that was exactly.
According to this author, C6 plus was set up way back during Somalia's long transitional period. It It was a mechanism, essentially, for external partners to coordinate their political interventions.
Framed as support, I imagine.
Framed as support, yes. But the source argues that in reality, it gave these external actors significant political leverage over Somalia's internal affairs, a coordination body that became perhaps more directive.
And rejecting it is seen as pivotal.
Very much so. The paper calls it a key legal and diplomatic turning point. It was Somalia explicitly pushing back, saying, no more external political oversight like this.
Asserting sovereignty.
Yes. The letter pointed towards Somalia's own institutions, like the federal parliament, and said future engagement needs to happen through these official state channels, not through these ad hoc external bodies.
That does sound like a deliberate cut at one of those tethers.
It absolutely is framed that way, one of the most significant untying efforts described. But there's a caveat.
Of course.
The paper cautions that this move, while strong legally, could end up being just symbolic. If the international community doesn't actually change its behavior and respect this shift, and just as importantly, if Somali institutions themselves don't follow through consistently.
So the declaration needs teeth, both internally and externally.
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that the diplomatic stance needs backing by consistent policy. Things like refusing to engage in those old parallel tracks,
Right.
Excluding actors who operate outside the constitutional framework. The source calls them illegitimate in that context, and really asserting control over national processes. It needs follow-through.
Okay. Now, the source doesn't shy away from naming names or specific examples of how these outdated arrangements might still be lingering. It mentions James Swan, the UN Special Representative.
It does. And just to be really clear for everyone listening, what we're about to discuss is the specific perspective and argument presented by the author of this paper concerning Mr. Swan's role. We're reporting on the source material here.
Understood. So what's the source's argument about his involvement?
The paper suggests that Mr. Swan's influence in Somali politics goes back further than his current role, that he's associated with that older, elite-focused consensus-building model.
The one the source says hasn't worked.
Exactly. The source alleges that even after the Somali government has made its position clear about wanting less external political interference, Mr. Swan continues to assert diplomatic influence. And crucially, the paper claims this often involves bypassing Somali institutions in favor of informal consultations with unelected elites.
And the problem with that, according to the author, why does that undermine the transition?
Because from the source's viewpoint, it directly contradicts the whole direction the government is trying to steer things. It undermines the authority, the legitimacy of the federal parliament and other official bodies that are supposed to be driving a representative democracy.
It bypasses the very institutions they're trying to build up.
That's the concern raised. And the paper even touches on a potential legal recourse if this perceived interference continues.
What's that?
It mentions the possibility of declaring a diplomat persona non grata, or PNG.
Expulsion, essentially.
Yes. The source points out that under international law, specifically Article 9 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations from 1961, a host country, a sovereign state, has the right to do this if a diplomat's actions are seen as incompatible with their diplomatic function or inconsistent with the country's laws or political will.
So the source is really emphasizing that diplomatic engagement needs to support the official structures, not go around them.
That's the core message there. Diplomacy should strengthen institutional legitimacy, not substitute for it by engaging with non-institutional players.
Okay, so we've talked about external tethers, that C6 plus legacy, certain diplomatic practices as described by the source, but the paper also digs into internal constraints. And it calls one perhaps the most entrenched constraint, this issue of recycling political elites.
Yeah, this is highlighted as a really sticky internal problem, a major rope holding things back. The author describes this pattern.
What pattern?
Where often under the banner of inclusive dialogue, former leaders, past presidents, prime ministers, speakers, even MPs keep getting brought back into the political mix.
Reinserted into the process.
Exactly. And the source is pretty sharp in its critique of this.
Why? What's the argument against it?
The argument is, look, many of these individuals already had their chance. And during their time in power, they either didn't manage to bring about real reform or, in some cases, were allegedly part of the problem, corruption, fragmentation, etc. So bringing them back isn't just seen as a habit. The source calls it a soft form of coercion. They return based on their old titles, not a fresh mandate from voters.
And the source notes?
And the source notes, often this happens with foreign facilitation.
So it's not about winning elections or public backing now.
Not at all. The source is really clear on this. It argues this recycling is fundamentally undemocratic. It completely lacks public legitimacy, which, the paper stresses, can only come from the ballot box, from consent.
Right.
And it has no basis in Somalia's constitution. It's just another tether. Another way the old system persists and prevents a truly new representative political class from emerging.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together, we have the vision, the partial reforms, but also the significant tethers, both external and internal. The source doesn't just diagnose the problem, though. It offers solutions, right? Concrete steps to fully untie the horse. What are the key recommendations?
Yeah, it outlines several pretty bold actions. First up, assert full political ownership. Meaning all electoral processes, all governance issues must be genuinely Somali-led and Somali-owned. External partners can support, sure, but they cannot direct or manage Somalia's internal political affairs. That's fundamental.
Okay, ownership first.
What else? Second, enforce the rejection of C6 plus PLEVA. That letter sent in June 2025. It needs to be more than paper. It has to translate into consistent policy.
Wow.
By actively dismantling any leftover parallel structures from that era, and by insisting that all international engagement flows through Somalia's recognized state institutions, no more side channels.
Make the legal move stick in practice. Got it.
Third, hold diplomats accountable. The source argues diplomatic missions need to operate strictly within the Vienna Convention rules.
No freelance.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And those individuals perceived by the Somali government as engaging in political engineering or undermining institutions. The source says they must face consequences. It repeats the point about PNG being a sovereign right if conduct is out of line.
Play by the international rule book. What's fourth?
Fourth, reject unelected political figures. This goes back to the elite recycling point. The source is adamant. Somalia's democratic future can't be built by bringing back the same figures associated with past failures or obstruction. Legitimacy, it says, must come from the ballot box, period.
No going back to those old models. Makes sense in their argument. And last one.
Finally, reform international engagement models. This is a call to Somalia's partners. Change how you help. Any assistance, technical or financial, must be channeled in ways that actually strengthen Somalia's constitutional institutions. Don't bypass them, don't undermine them, reinforce them. So
wrapping up our deep dive here, what's the ultimate conclusion this paper draws about Somalia's path?
Well, the core takeaway isn't that Somalia's attempt at democracy has failed. Not at all. The story the source tells is one of a process that has been deliberately held back, restrained. The author argues the Somali government has shown its hand through laws, through public buy-in, through specific diplomatic moves like rejecting C6+. It has stated its desire for real sovereignty, real self-governance.
But just stating it isn't the end game.
Definitely not, according to this paper. The author's final point is really powerful. These declarations, these legal steps, they must be matched with assertive action.
Action is key.
Yes. The paper basically says the time for elite deals, for relying on external structures for political guidance, for diplomatic ambiguity, that era needs to end. Decisively. The message is that the Somali people, through their government, aren't asking for permission. They're demanding the sovereign space to run their own country using their own laws and institutions.
The structures are there, the laws are passed, the voters are ready, the horse is ready.
That's the image, yes. And the source argues what's needed now is the will, the assertiveness to remove those final constraints. The ropes, the paper concludes, need a clean cut, not just loosening or debating. Sovereignty has to be fully enacted, fully respected, both internally and by international partners.
It definitely paints a very clear, if challenging, picture. Okay, so thinking about the source, its argument about the tethered horse needing those ropes cut assertively. Here's something for you, the listener, to chew on. What does it really take for any nation, after it's legally declared its sovereignty, set up its democratic framework? What does it take to actually make that transition stick, to have that sovereignty fully respected and implemented, not just on paper, but in reality, especially when you're dealing with complex global politics and often powerful internal interests that might resist that change?